Hello, my name's Olurotimi Osha. Today is July the 31st, 2026, and I'm continuing with my discussion of Homer's epic, The Odyssey. I'm discussing the final book. This is the big one, and it captures all of the three elements of Greek zeitgeist, which Homer captured in his epic. I've discussed these before. Métis, which is cunning intelligence. This features very little. I'm going to say how it does. And then there's, of course, Xenia, which is Zeus's law of hospitality, being hospitable to strangers or just being hospitable to one another's. And then, of course, Nostos, that's the homecoming, returning to one's identity, one's native soil. So, today I'm discussing how uh, Odysseus would reconcile, would meet with his father, right? He'd meet with his father again. And so this was the homecoming. This is the actual homecoming. And, it's funny that Odysseus, right, is known as the trickster as well. And I understand that Christopher Nolan doesn't really emphasize Odysseus's cunning intelligence, right, which is very significant, especially for the Greeks, right? This is, Greeks are known for their wisdom, and that's what Odysseus was known for, right? He was the one who was cunning enough, right? He was deceptive. He came up with the invention of the device of the Trojan horse, right, which they used to steal into Troy and ultimately destroyed Troy. And of course, that was in the Iliad, right? But they kept having flashbacks and references to, the war in Troy. But in the Odyssey, we see the most important trick that Odysseus played, and then after which he showed hubris, and of course, it led to the curse of Poseidon and his wandering the seas for 10 years, and he wasn't able to return home until Zeus gave an order through Hermes that Calypso had to let him go, and they should just let him return to his family. And that trick was the one he played on the son of Poseidon, the one-eyed Cyclop, Polyphemus, right? When Odysseus tells him his name was nobody, right? But of course, Odysseus, in his moment of hubris, after he was making his escape and he was on his ship, he just had to stick it to him, and he taunted him and he said, "Look, if anybody wants to know who blinded you, tell them it was I, Odysseus, sacker, son of Laertes in Ithaca, sacker of Troy, the destroyer of cities." Odysseus just had to show that hubris, and that was when Polyphemus knew his name, knew his identity, his address, everything, and then he appeals to his father Poseidon, who's god of the seas, to curse Odysseus, to wander the seas forever, and and Poseidon does punish him with that, and so Odysseus is just wandering circuitously, and he's in torture, right? He doesn't seem like the victor who vanquished Troy. But in any event, the last trick Odysseus would play was on his own father, right? His father, of course, they used that modern term "dad," in Christopher Nolan's blockbuster, right? It's a money maker, uh, but I don't know, I don't know why he used that presentism or anachronism. It's the American accent to me. I mean, I'm eager to watch the film. I haven't seen the film. I've read tons of reviews, and I've watched clips, specific clips to see, okay, what was left out. And book 24 was left out. Odysseus's homecoming, his meeting with his father, right? That was left out, and this is very significant because this is a homecoming. Everybody kept talking about, well, the stories about homecoming. The homecoming is really to his father, because you see a lot of things happen. Um, and importantly, in this book, in this meeting with father, with Odysseus's father, there are lots of talks about gifts, presents, and feasting. You see, this is huge amongst the ancient Greek civilization, and that's all part of Xenia. Now, also, something else that I found remarkable was in his 20-year journey, his homecoming, and he's, obviously it was a homecoming for him to meet with his father, his wife. That was in book 23, meeting with his wife, his son Telemachus. Telemachus follows him to his father's house, and then the other people he meets with that he's happy to return to are his father's slaves and his own slaves, right? Which is interesting, right? I've been gone from my home in Nigeria for over 27 years, right? I've been in America, and now in Maryland, I'm sort of held captive, right? Um, but in my, I foresee my homecoming, right? When I see people I'm eager to see that will make it a homecoming. Of course, my mother and my siblings, but after that would be my childhood friends that I grew up with. I'm eager to see my childhood friends. And but so when we're seeing Odysseus's homecoming, right, his long-awaited homecoming after 20 years, in this final book, book 24, after his father, right, and of course his son, and he'd already met with his wife in book 23. Um, the other people, right, that consummate that homecoming for him, then fulfill that homecoming, are his father's slaves and his slaves, right? And let me just mention the characters, and then I'll get into the narrative of the trick Odysseus would play on his dad. So he left his own home with two of his own slaves. He lives with Telemachus, right, his son, and then Eumaeus, right? Eumaeus is a faithful slave in his home, and then Philocius, right? So those two slaves come along, and then in his father's household, he meets an old slave called Dolius and his sons. Dolius and his sons. He's an old slave, and Dolius's wife. Now, Homer kept referring to Dolius's wife not by name. He doesn't mention her name like they mentioned Dolius's name or Eumaeus's name or Philocius's name, but they kept referring to her as the Sicel woman. And Sicel woman, Sicel is Sicily, right? So the land of Sicily. So you can see the interactions the Greeks had with, Sicilians, who would become part of, Italians, later on and during the Roman Empire, right? They become Romans, So it's kind of interesting. So she was a slave from Sicily, and she was an old woman, and she bathed Odysseus's father and all of that. So those are the characters that are in book 24 in the father's household. So this is what Odysseus does. So after Odysseus leaves his house, he leaves his house, goes with his son Telemachus, and then his two slaves, Eumaeus and Philocius. By the way, as I use this term slave, different translators have used different words, right? Different terms. I used the translations I read were from E.V. Rowe and Samuel Butler, and so some translators chose not to use the term slave. Maybe they'd say servant, and some would outright say slave, right? Emily Watson, I think, was in her translation, which Christopher Nolan used. She said that she went into the old Greek text and language, and the term that was used was slave, and so she wanted to be true to the original language. And so slave, the status of these people were slaves. But it's interesting how they were very close and treated like members of the same household. So I want to show what happened. So Telemachus, Odysseus, and then the two slaves, Philocius and Eumaeus, they arrive at the father's house. Then Odysseus gives them instruction that to go and get the best pig, kill the best pig, right, and prepare it, to cook it, right? So you see, food was so important in that ancient Greek civilization. Food, it's all over the place, right? All over the story, always eating, right? What got Odysseus and his men into trouble with the one-eyed Cyclops Polyphemus, was food. Odysseus and his men went into his cave and they took his cheese. And Odysseus said, "Well, the owner of the cave owes them Zeus's law of hospitality, so they were going to sit down and wait for the owner to come back." And it caused a problem. But when the owner came, he shut his door, he sealed his cave with a huge rock, right? And then he immediately eats two of Odysseus's men, right? Because it was a giant. So you see, food was so important throughout this story. You see, even when they meet with Circe lures them with potions and food. She poisons the food she gives them and the wine. And she turns them into food, pigs, swine, right? So food was so important throughout this, the book, the Odyssey, right? And you see also with the Lotus Eaters, right? They gave, they intoxicated the men with these fruits, right? That had the narcotic, that basically made them forget everything. Food was so constant. When Odysseus was washed ashore, shipwrecked on the island of Scheria, the land of the Phaeacians, they welcomed him into the palace and they gave him a huge feast, a huge banquet. So you see that Xenia was so important. It runs through the entire theme, constantly food, replenishments, and when he was leaving, they gave him food. So let me continue. So Odysseus tells them to prepare the best pig in the kitchen. And guess what? Telemachus, the prince, is working with the slaves, and Homer's describing how he's preparing the food with them. They cut up the meat, mixing the wine and the water. So the prince isn't just sitting down; he's actually working with the slaves. I guess they were trying to project some kind of egalitarian situation system, despite the different social status, right? A king, a prince, noblemen, and of course the slaves. So you see a fusion, like a mixing of the stratification of the social classes. So Odysseus finds his father, right? Odysseus finds his father in his garden, right? He was in his vineyard and he was farming, right? So the slaves were not there. He was alone. He had all these slaves, but they were not on the farm with him. His father was dressed in shabby clothes, like a slave would be dressed in shabby clothes. So the word Homer used, well, the translation used was he had a woebegone, right? A woebegone appearance. Woebegone means like really disheveled, looking, looking really, disheveled, slovenly, right? Woebegone, full of sorrow, not looking good, right? Worn out. Woebegone was a word that was used in the translation. So Odysseus saw him from afar, and Odysseus, of course, he's moved. But Odysseus decides he's going to be crafty with him. That's a word that is used in the Butler's translation. He's going to be crafty with him. He wanted to see if he would be able to remind him, and he wanted to know his mindset, right? Because Odysseus, when he had been instructed by the witch Circe to go into the underworld to consult the blind, the prophet or whatever who was dead, the ghost of the prophet Tiresias, who could see the future. He had seen his mother, that she was dead, right? She was dead from grief, and he'd been trying to hug her, and he couldn't. Of course, Christopher Nolan left that scene also. He left that out of his own his rendition in his movie. But anyway, that was very significant. So I guess Odysseus wanted to know how grief had affected his father, his mental state. And Odysseus was very conscious of what he was trying to do, because eventually his father would actually join him, the forces he would use to fight the townspeople, right? So Odysseus wanted to know the state of his father. He hadn't seen him since. So Odysseus decides he's going to be crafty with him. He's going to play a trick on him, and he's going to pretend to be somebody else. So Odysseus assumes this personality, this identity, calls himself Eperitus, right? The son of a king, Ephidus, from Alybus, right? From another place called Alybus, right? So Odysseus approaches him, and Odysseus talks to him in sort of like a rude manner, right? So the last trick Odysseus plays is on the father who spawned him, right? So Odysseus the trickster. So it's the last trick in the Odyssey. It's the last trick, and it's ironic. I don't know if Homer, if it's deliberate, but the last trick that Odysseus the trickster plays was on the man, right? The man who actually spawned him, the man who gave birth to him, his own father. That was the final act, right? The first relevant person to him, his father. It was also the last person that Odysseus would play a trick on in the book. So Odysseus greets him, and Odysseus, he goes into this long monologue. It's a dialogue, he's long screed. And he tells him about, wow, that he's an excellent gardener, an excellent farm, that he takes very good care of his farm, but he has to say he doesn't take as good, he doesn't do the same with his appearance, right? Because Odysseus goes, Odysseus actually calls him a slave, right? Imagine calling a king, a former king, the father of a king, because his father, Laertes, was a former king, right? So Odysseus, intentionally misrepresents him as a king and says, "Look, he looks so shabby, but his appearance, his face and his physical appearance, looks like one of noble birth." So he's like that he works very hard, and his actual master must be very kind to him, right? And that's why he has that appearance of one of noble birth. That's what Odysseus is implying. And Odysseus wants to know who the owner of the land is. And Odysseus is talking, and then Odysseus says he wants to know, first of all, is this the land of Ithaca? That he saw a fellow, right? But the fellow was dull because the guy said it was Ithaca. But before he could ask him more questions and engage him in dialogue, in conversation about, because he was looking for a friend of his who was from Ithaca, the son of Laertes, right? Of course, that's Odysseus. So Odysseus is pretending to be a guy called Eperitus, right? Eperitus, and that he's from Alibus. He's the son of a king, King Ephidius, right? So that's what Odysseus is telling his own father, and says, look, he's actually looking for the son of Laertes, Odysseus. And so he tells him how Odysseus is the best person he's ever met as a guest, that Odysseus was his guest, and he gave him loads of presents, including gold and all, and lots of luxuries. And he hadn't seen him in a while, and, that now he wants to see him. Is this his land? Does he know of this guy? And of course, Odysseus' father is sad. Odysseus' father, Laertes, then tells him that, okay, that's his son. And he tells him that, well, but, so his father assumes that Odysseus is dead. And he tells him what's going on, that the land has been taken over by wicked people, that if Odysseus had been alive and around, that, he would have been able to repay his hospitality, but, he's not around. And so Odysseus' father asks him that, okay, that when last did he see Odysseus, right? He wanted to know when last did he see Odysseus. So Odysseus, pretending to be this Eperitus, son of King Ephidius, tells him, well, he saw him 5 years ago. At which point, Odysseus' father carries dust and throws it on his head, right, lamenting, right? I thought that was interesting because if you've read the Bible, if you read the Bible, you notice it's a common practice of woe, like an expression of woe, of regret, of sadness, right, of pain, of sorrow in the Bible. If you remember the book of Job, when Job's friends came to see Job and they saw he was afflicted, three of them, they took up dust and they threw it on their heads and fell on the ground. So it was a common thing that was done in the Bible. You see it in the Bible, in the Old Testament particularly, right? So Odysseus' father does that, carries dust and throws it on his head. At that time, Odysseus was now heartbroken. He couldn't, he was heartbroken. He couldn't continue with the pretense. And then he hugs his father, tells him that it's him. He's actually Odysseus. He's returned home after 20 years. But his father, just like his daughter-in-law, just like Penelope, doubted, wanted proof. So his father said, okay, he needs to show him that he should give him proof. Now, the proof Odysseus gives him, first of all, is the scar he got on his leg, on his thigh, from a boar's tusk, right? A boar's tusk. And Odysseus explains how he got it. Odysseus says that he got it when the father sent him to go and receive presents again from his maternal grandfather, Autolycus. Autolycus was his maternal grandfather, and he was supposed to get presents from him, and that was how he got that scar. And then the second proof he gave him was he pointed out the trees, the vineyards of trees in the vineyard that Odysseus's father, right, Laertes, gave him when he was a child, and how he walked him around the garden, the vineyard, telling him about the trees. You know, there were apple trees, there were pears, you know, and loads of them. And Odysseus tells him, you know, everything. And his father believed that this was indeed Odysseus, and his father grabbed him and he wept. So you see, gifts, presents, it was so important. And now, after all of that, right, Odysseus's, Laertes's servant, his slave, that's Dolius's wife, the Sicil woman, that's a Sicilian woman, right, the woman from Sicily. She bathed him, anointed him, and they all sat down. The food that had been prepared by Odysseus' son Telemachus and his slaves, they all sat down. Odysseus, the father, and the slaves sat down together and ate. But Odysseus and the men waited for another slave, for the husband of the Sicil woman, the woman of Sicily, right, who had just bathed Odysseus' father, to arrive. And that was Dolius, right, and his sons. And they were all glad. And Odysseus mentioned that they had been waiting for them to arrive. So Odysseus sat down, right, his homecoming, was sitting down with a feast with his father, his son, and their slaves, right, and the slave's wife, right, in father's home. So this was the homecoming, right, and it was a big thing. So feasting, you see how important it was. And you know, that scene that moves on to the final act. There's an assembly of the townspeople, because Odysseus has told his father that they have to act quick, right, but they ate first, and that they have to act quick because he knew that the townspeople were coming after him. As he said, he had been slaughtering, he had been killing the suitors, and the suitors, of course, came from noble families. And Antinous' father had gathered people. They were at an assembly. They were saying they should go and kill, you know, Odysseus, right? Now it's interesting that there was one guy though, Halitherses, I don't know how to pronounce his name, Halitherses spoke up in the assembly. Halitherses was the son of a master, and it was said that only he in the assembly knew the past and the future. And he was warning the townspeople who wanted to go against Odysseus that, look, they would be destroyed, they would not win against Odysseus, because the men had done something wrong, that the suitors had done something wrong, eating Odysseus out of house and home. They had violated his home, his hospitality, and been mean to his wife and all of that, and that they would not win this battle and they should cease. Right? That's not how it ends. I'm going to do another video narrating the final act, how it actually ends. But just for a lot of people to be able to understand that Christopher Nolan's tale of regret, right, of Odysseus being regretful of the war, of the Trojan War, that's not what is actually in the book, right? You see, something Laertes was saying was when Odysseus tells him that, well, he'd killed the suitors in his home, Laertes was excited. He exclaimed with joy, and he said he wishes if only he had been younger, he would have been with him at his home, killing the suitors, right? And it reminded him of his own time as a king, when he was king of the Cephallenians. That's what they were called. Like, they were king of the Cephallenians, and about all the great wars that he'd led the people, in. So the Greeks lived for martial glory. There's no talk of regret with regard to war in the Odyssey. The only thing that is close to regret was when Odysseus saw Achilles in the underworld, and Christopher Nolan left this out. And while Odysseus was singing his praise, because Achilles was a ghost, and Odysseus, was human, but had been transported. He was, he was trying to find out his future, and Achilles tells him that, hey, he would rather be a slave, right, a living slave to a poor tenant farmer and be king of the dead in the underworld, right? King of the dead in the underworld. So that's the only instance of regret with respect to martial glory. And, so in any event, that's the homecoming. I'm going to do the final video and regarding how the Odyssey was resolved. My name is Oluro Timiosha. I'll keep you posted. Thank you.